Volodymyr Zelenskyy is calling for a tribunal similar to the Nuremberg trials to deal with alleged Russian war crimes in Ukraine. Several senior Nazis were executed after the Nuremberg hearings following World War II. The Ukrainian president was speaking after visiting the International Criminal Court in The Hague. He accused Russia of committing thousands of war crimes in his country. He said Vladimir Putin and others responsible for the war must be held accountable.
Impunity is the key that opens the door to aggression. If you look at any war, any war of aggression in the history, they all have one thing in common. The perpetrators of the war didn't believe they would have to stand to answer for what they did. They must stand to answer for war. Whoever brings war must receive judgment.
Well, he was speaking in The Hague, and our correspondent Rosie Burchard is there. Welcome, Rosie. What else did the Ukrainian president say?
Well, it was really an impassioned plea for accountability here in The Hague, the capital of international law, the headquarters of the International Criminal Court, the headquarters of the International Court of Justice and other special tribunals. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy even asked for those listening to him to take a moment of silence to reflect on the victims of what he says are Russian war crimes. He spent time listing them. He talked about rapes. He talked about cases of civilian killings, about cases of abductions. Those are, of course, things which Moscow denies, but it's clear that President Zelenskyy and those who are with him here, including the Dutch Prime Minister, simply aren't buying it. Now, President Zelenskyy overall here use this moment in this symbolic location, The Hague, but also on a symbolic day, because this is Remembrance Day in the Netherlands, when Dutch people reflect on those lives lost in the Second World War. And President Zelenskyy, I think, using this moment to try and convince the Dutch people to stay with him. And certainly that was the message, the reply from Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. He says, "We stand shoulder to shoulder with you." President Zelenskyy did even make a little joke. He said, "I am not the Volodymyr you want to see here in The Hague." And of course, by that he meant he would like to see Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, instead here in The Hague standing charges. And President Putin is indeed a fugitive now officially of the International Criminal Court. There is an arrest warrant out for him. But that really just shows just how difficult international criminal justice can be overall in terms of processes, because there are no international police that could go and arrest Vladimir Putin and bring him to stand charges here in The Hague. So the cogs of international justice do tend to turn slowly. President Zelenskyy, however, saying he's confident he will one day see the tribunal he is so urgently calling for. He says we will win and we will see this in the future.
OK, thank you for that, DW correspondent Rosie Burchard in The Hague. Meanwhile, the European Union has warned Russia not to use an alleged drone attack on Moscow as a pretext to escalate the war. The Kremlin says Washington organised the attack and Ukraine carried it out. Moscow claims it was an attempt to assassinate President Vladimir Putin and added that sabotage attacks by Kyiv are increasing. The US and Ukraine both deny involvement in the drone incident. Let's get more from our Washington bureau chief, Ines Pohl. Welcome, Ines. What is Washington saying about these Russian claims?
Well, the US, Phil, has dismissed these accusations again this morning. White House spokesman John Kirby said on cable news, "I can assure you there was no involvement by the United States. Whatever it was, it did not involve us." And he also said that the US did not encourage or enable Ukraine to strike Russia. That's pretty much the same, actually, what Secretary of State Blinken said yesterday in an interview with the Washington Post right after the news broke.
So have US officials commented on who might actually be behind this alleged attack?
Well, analysis and members of the US government have dismissed the idea that anyone would make an attempt on Putin's life, because they say strategically it would make little sense, and that the drone in question is far too small to really cause a big damage. We have to keep in mind the US has been very careful in not provoking Vladimir Putin, for example, with sending F-16 fighters, so it would not really make sense that they themselves would be involved regarding Ukraine. They're investigating it. If Ukraine is behind this attack, but they also say, if so, they would have had no knowledge whatsoever.
Right. It all does seem very, very odd because, as you say there, Washington has been discouraging Kyiv from taking rash action. And we saw in those recent Pentagon leaks that Washington has been doing very much of that throughout this war.
Yes, it is true. I mean, and Phil, we have to keep in mind the first victim in wartime is always the truth. So it's definitely right to ask questions. But again, I think the logic should be also involved in trying to answer this question. And why would the United States be at this very moment, right before the spring offensive of Ukraine, be involved in a drone attack with so little possible outcome? So I have the tendency at this very point to trust what Secretary of State Blinken and John Kirby said today and yesterday.
Thanks for that, DW Washington Bureau Chief Ines Pohl.